But has it ever been proven that President Assad of Syria has ordered the use of chemical weapons? Joining me now from Washington is the New York Times best-selling author of The Management of Savagery, How America's National Security State Fueled the Rise of Al-Qaeda, ISIS and Donald Trump. Max Blumenthal. Max, thanks so much for coming back on. Let's just begin with the new reports of Syrian chemical attacks. Just as we had that leaked OPCW document suggesting there was a fake justification for last year's Anglo-French-American bombings of Syria.
What my book, The Management of Savagery, details is the whole history of U.S. and UK collaboration with jihadist and extreme Islamist elements, using them as proxies from the Afghan proxy war starting in 1979 to the present in Syria. And you know, as I detail this history, I show how an entire propaganda apparatus has been set up, first to obscure the sordid history of this collaboration, but also to stimulate Western support for intervention, for increased support for these proxy forces and direct intervention. And, you know, this isn't surprising that the U.S. is now alleging that there might be another chemical attack, because the Trump administration, and this goes to the heart of another theme in the book, which is the contradictions of the national security state. The most Islamophobic administration in U.S. history is actually protecting the base of the largest franchise of Al-Qaeda since 9/11, which is Idlib. And this goes unmentioned when the U.S. makes these strange allegations about chemical attacks. But the whole point of this allegation is to once again trip the red line. And as a former Obama advisor told Harper's, imposing the red line policy is an invitation for a false flag attack, the same kind of false flag attack that we apparently witnessed last year in Duma, which an OPCW engineers report that was suppressed revealed.
Okay, well, I have to say that the press here is saying that it's a humanitarian catastrophe in Idlib as those Islamists are being attacked. And as we know, in the book it shows Islamists being moved on from the war on Libya, the NATO war in Libya, and also to Syria, but also, arguably, to Manchester. This is the week of the anniversary of the Manchester atrocity. Why do you think it is that no one's mentioning UK intelligence links to the bomber at the Ariana Grande concert?
My book details the whole history also of what took place in Libya on the grounds of the responsibility to protect doctrine, where there was this massive NATO intervention. And the MI6 called on its rat line in Manchester of Libyan exiles who had been affiliated with the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, which was a longtime affiliate of Al-Qaeda, led by figures who were trained and armed during the Afghan proxy war by the CIA. One of those was Ramadan Abadi, who is the father of Salman Abadi, went to Libya. They had their passports restored, were given free passage to go fight Gaddafi, and Salman wound up training with ISIS, was much more hardcore than his father, then went to Syria to train with ISIS, comes back on a Royal Navy vessel, and then blows up a nail bomb at an Ariana Grande concert. But this goes much further than one man and one bombing. In the U.S., there was sort of the Benghazi scandal, and that was an attempt to kind of paper over the whole catastrophe of Libya, where John McCain actually parachuted into Benghazi and met with Abdel Hakim Belhaj, who was the leader and co-founder of the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, longtime affiliate of Al-Qaeda, in order to kosher this organization before NATO intervened.
Well, John McCain features in your book because he and Rudy Giuliani and a few others, all associated with the group that is now off the terrorist watch list here in the EU and the United States, the MEK. Do you see them using the MEK against the Iranian government in terms of asymmetric warfare, guerrilla warfare against Tehran?
Well, yeah, a lot of these figures also have their names on a lot of the regime change documents in the 90s, which were calling for taking down 7 governments in 5 years, and now we're seeing those names checked off the regime change target board. And you know, now these figures are showing up in Washington, as well as John Bolton, who is the head of the National Security Council of the White House, doing high-profile, well-paid speaking gigs for the MEK, getting like 40,000 or 50,000 a pop. And what is the MEK? Well, it's an Iranian exile regime change cult that abuses its members. It appears to be funded not only by Iranian exiles, but Saudi Arabia. And we recently witnessed Rudy Giuliani in New York at a gathering of the MEK celebrating the fact, and I don't even know if it's a fact, that Iranians were selling their organs in the street because they had become so desperate thanks to the crushing effect of U.S. sanctions. So this organization is dedicated, as Donald Trump vowed in a tweet last week, to the full-scale destruction of Iran as a functional country. And the fact that it has what is effectively an asset in the National Security Council should be chilling to anyone.
Talking about U.S. policy trying to starve people into submission, the European Union and the British government obviously seek the overthrow of the Venezuelan government. What did you make of this week's announcement that the United States is trying to stop an infamous food program for the poor in Venezuela?
Yeah, on the one hand, you have the United States kind of coming out in the open and essentially admitting that its goal with sanctions is to starve the Venezuelan people, especially the poorest members and most vulnerable members of its society. The CLAP program feeds over 6 million Venezuelans. Over 15% of Venezuelan society depends on these bi-monthly food boxes that also provide sanitary supplies. And I saw how it was distributed, how effective and important it is, and how it's distributed without political preference. And the U.S. now wants to apply sanctions on this. So the Venezuelan opposition has to decide now, do they want to have the mass starvation of their own constituents on their hands? And that means going along with Washington's agenda. And I can actually see the Venezuelan opposition starting to fragment with larger and larger segments moving towards dialogue, which is what needs to happen to get Venezuela out of this crisis. And of course, Washington and the Organization for American States, which is its tool in Latin America, want anything but dialogue and mediation. So we're actually seeing a rift between Washington and the Venezuelan opposition. And I think that's actually a positive development for Venezuelans, even as they starve and die under sanctions.
The epigraph to the book is from Donald Trump, one of the epigraphs where Trump says, "We underscore that states that sponsor terrorism are falling victim to the evil they promote." The book is full of information sources, perhaps WikiLeaks and so on. Are you surprised that actually the information is clearly there? I'm not sure Trump was specifically talking about the United States. I think he was talking about Iran there.
Yeah, well, one of the other quotes in the epigraph is from a WikiLeaks document. It was a State Department email from Jake Sullivan, Hillary Clinton's longtime foreign policy advisor, gleefully declaring that al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria. And so it casts Trump's disgusting quote, where he was actually sort of celebrating an ISIS attack on the Iranian parliament, a democratic institution in Iran, in a very ironic light. And this is the price that the U.S. has paid for getting in bed with jihadists and extreme Islamists to achieve a geopolitical goal. 9/11, the whole catastrophe of the war on terror, the boondoggle of Iraq, the destruction of Libya, the fragmentation of Syria and the refugee crises, as well as the rise of the Islamophobia industry that figures like Donald Trump drew on to gain national popularity.
And just finally, it's clear in the book that President Obama, there's Hillary Clinton, the DNC come under particular scrutiny in this book. Ironic that you tend to privilege or accuse of privileging class over identity when you seem to show in the book that Clinton, Michelle Obama even, let alone President Obama, it's the DNC that is responsible for attacking LGBT rights, being pro-racist, being misogynist, being Islamophobic, anti-Semitic, anti-Christian, anti-communist.
The considerations of the global population, which is mostly brown and black, never comes into focus when foreign policy decisions are made. And so when on the side of the Democrats, you have the liberal interventionists who speak the rhetoric of the responsibility to protect doctrine, of humanitarian interventionism. And what they always wind up achieving when they intervene in a place like Libya is to make the most vulnerable populations of those societies the most exposed to harm from extreme sociopathic elements. And so in Libya, you had the Black Tawerga population getting massacred after NATO's intervention. In Syria, you have pogroms and the mass slaughter of religious minorities, Christians, Shia, Alawites. And so, you know, it really casts the identity politics that emerge out of the halls of the DNC and that are really the official line of the Democratic Party in an ironic light when you consider what happens to populations on the other side of the gun when there's a Democratic administration in power. And of course, you see continuity through the Trump administration more than anything, despite the freakout that the national security state and the Democrats have had about Trump being president and supposedly being Putin's puppet. Trump has been much more aggressive across the Middle East than Obama actually was. He, unlike Obama, not only intervened twice directly in Syria, bombing Syria twice apparently on the basis of false information, but he has armed the Ukrainian military. He's imposed much harsher sanctions on Iran and on Russia and Venezuela. So it's not only continuity, but a constant escalation that harms the most vulnerable people of the world, who happen to be mostly brown and black.